What constitutes a life well lived? How do we measure the success of a man or a woman's life? Fellow Toastmasters and welcome guests, I had just recently finished reading a book on our second president, John Adams. Before reading this biography, pretty much what I knew about John Adams was what I learned in Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? He signed the Declaration of Independence, he was the first vice president, and of course, he was our second president. But after reading this book, after learning so much about his life and who he was, I realized that this was a man who had lived a successful life. Why do I say this? And what can all of us learn from who this man was that will help us improve our own lives? First, John Adams was a man who, in the service of his country, consistently demonstrated integrity and bravery. Even when the right thing to do was obfuscated by the passions of the people, he maintained the right course as he saw it. Secondly, John Adams was a man to which family was of the utmost importance. He was loyal and loving to his family, especially his wife Abigail, throughout their long marriage. And lastly, maybe not as clear in the book, but something that I really pulled out, is that John Adams was a man who took the time, no matter what, to enjoy the small things in life. A man who appreciated the beautiful world around him. But first I want to talk about his integrity and his bravery. Now, of course, many of us are aware that this is a man who was one of the original patriots, a man who participated passionately and boldly in the American Revolution, and a man who really was instrumental in establishing the government of our great nation. But besides all of that, I want to point out a few specific examples. Before the American Revolution, tensions were already very high in the colonies. People were angry. They were angry about the taxes, and they were angry that there was all these British army within their cities, especially Boston. And on March 5th of 1770, that tension and that anger boiled over. Throughout the day, crowds gathered in front of the British army post. By the end of the day, there were 300 to 400 angry people rioting and surrounding 10 British officers. Can you just picture it? In the melee, the British officers fired their muskets and killed 5 people. Now, during this time, John Adams was already a patriot. And he was also beginning his political career. But what you may not know is that he was a very successful lawyer in New England. And when they called upon him to defend these British officers, he said yes. He said yes, even though it was an extremely unpopular thing to do. And he said yes, even though it could damage his fledgling political career. And he did this because it was the right thing to do. He said, these men deserve a fair trial, even if they are British officers. And justice is blind to the passions of the populace. He did the right thing, even when it was difficult, and even when it was unpopular. And he did this even later in his career as the President of the United States. After the French Revolution, the relationship between France and the U.S. had soured. France expected the U.S. to support them in their war against Britain, and when that support was not forthcoming, they began attacking U.S. ships at sea. So the U.S., in response, sent diplomats over to try and smooth things out. But the French said, we will not negotiate unless you give us some money, give us a little bribe. Well, this was very insulting to the Americans. How dare you not negotiate with us? And the war cry sounded. The population wanted to go to war with France, and the politicians were all over it. They capitalized on the fervor to try and further their political careers. Does any of this sound familiar? But not John Adams. Under intense criticism, he maintained a policy of not going to war with France. He built up the U.S. Navy to defend our ships. But by the end of his presidency, he had again established peace with France. The right thing, even when it was difficult. Another characteristic of John Adams was his relationship with his family, especially his wife Abigail, as I mentioned. John and Abigail are a true American love story. 54 years of marriage. They made it through political upheavals, through devastating personal tragedies. They lost their baby girl when she was not even 2 years old, for example. And they made it through long separations during his political career. During those times, they wrote 1,000 letters to each other. And what stood out to me the most was no matter what he was going through, no matter what the situation, and no matter how long the years they had been together, their letters were so full of affection and tenderness and playfulness. She called him my dearest friend, and he called her Miss Adorable. Their affection sustained them through the hardest points of their lives. And I think that's what makes him a good character. Lastly, John Adams was a man who took the time to appreciate the world around him and the little things. He often took very long walks outside. Now imagine John Adams, if you will. He's not a little man, little on the weighty side. He enjoyed his food, but he would walk for miles and miles through his farmlands, or when he was in Philadelphia, through the city, because no matter what was going on, he knew that if he could get out there and connect with the outside world, with the beautiful world around him, that it would put those troubles into perspective. He often said, I should take more delight in my garden than in the dominion of the world. He was also a man who enjoyed his reading. You could often find him curled up with a book, and he maintained that even when his eyesight was going late in old age. He said, "You are never alone with a poet in your pocket." So what can we take from the character of this great man who lived a successful life? Now, I know that many of us in this room are never going to be the part of a founding of a great nation, maybe except for Chance. Or write 1,000 letters to our spouse. Who has that time? But as you walk away from this meeting, as you're going out to your cars and driving home to your families, I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. Do I do the right thing, even when it's hard and even when it's not popular? Do I show my loved ones how much I care about them? Do I tell them often enough? And do I really take the time, no matter what drama is going on, to appreciate this beautiful world that we're so blessed to live within? If you can answer yes to those 3 questions, then you can say, you have a life well lived. And I want to leave you with John Adams' own words. Griefs upon griefs, and disappointments upon disappointments. What then? It is a gay, merry world notwithstanding. Mr. Toastmaster.